The Galactic Council chamber sat at the center of Nexus Station like a molar in a jaw. 40 stories of curved walls, observation glass, and cold lighting that made every species in it look slightly dead. 26 civilizations had pooled their money and their arguments to build it over 3 centuries. The ceiling alone had taken 40 years to agree on. It smelled like recycled air and old decisions. Ambassador Iran of the Thal had occupied the same curved seat in the observer's gallery for 11 years. Before that, a different seat in a different chamber. Before that, war rooms, peace tables, crisis centers on 4 different stations. He was 412 years old. His people aged the way coastlines changed, so slowly that no single generation noticed. But the evidence piled up if you knew where to look. His skin had gone from the blue-gray of deep water to something closer to slate. His hands, folded on the desk in front of him, looked like they had been carved rather than grown. He had watched 200 wars from rooms exactly like this one. He knew how they ended. The announcement from the Kithara hegemony arrived at the 6th hour of the standard cycle, formatted in the hegemony's usual way. Clean lines, official font, the hegemony seal pressed into the header like a thumbprint. It was brief. The Kithara did not waste words on species who had no say in the matter. The planetary body designated Earth, System Sol, Sector 7G, is hereby placed under hegemony pacification order. Projected compliance window, 72 standard hours. Non-resistance is advised. A junior delegate from the Melvari Compact made a sound that translated loosely as finely. Nobody disagreed with him. Earth had been a scheduling problem for the Council for 2 decades. An unregistered world in a sector that 3 different member species had economic interest in, sitting there without treaties, without a fleet, without anything that qualified as galactic standing. A loose thread. The hegemony was, if nothing else, good at pulling loose threads. Iran noted the announcement, filed it under standard pacification, 72-hour window, no complications, opened his afternoon agenda. He was halfway through a trade dispute between the Orvani and the Sulith Confederation when the chamber doors opened and she walked in. The human ambassador to the Galactic Council was not what most member species expected when they imagined a representative of Earth. They expected someone large, maybe. Loud, certainly. Humanity's reputation, what little reputation a Tier 0 world could accumulate, was built entirely on second-hand accounts from survey teams who had observed the planet without landing. The accounts all agreed on 2 things. First, humans were a species in a state of constant conflict with other humans. Second, they were remarkably difficult to kill, which was considered an unfortunate side effect of the first thing. Dr. Priya Anand was not large. She was a small woman in her late 40s, built like someone who had spent a long time at desks. Her credentials were barely accredited. Earth had gotten an observer seat at the Council 6 years ago, mostly because a Thal trade survey had accidentally made contact and the Council had to do something with them. The seat came with no vote, no floor time, and a very small office 2 levels below the main chamber that shared a wall with the station's water processing unit. She walked to her observer's position at the edge of the floor. She set down a travel mug. She looked at the hegemony's announcement on the main display. Then she formally objected. The chamber did not go quiet out of respect. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone drops their fork at a formal dinner. A brief collective flinch before everyone remembers they are not supposed to look. Under Council Protocol 14, she said, and her voice did not shake. So on any pacification action against a planet holding a Council observer seat requires a formal review period of no less than 30 days. The Council's head administrator, a Velhari named Sauce, who had held the position for 60 years and had the patience of someone who had processed 10,000 procedural objections, looked at his records, looked at Dr. Anand, looked at his records again. Protocol 14, he said carefully, applies to full member worlds. Earth holds an observer seat. An observer seat is not full membership. The protocol, she said, does not specify full membership. It specifies Council observer seat, which Earth holds. I have the exact language here if you need it. She did have the exact language. She read it. It took 4 minutes. The chamber was very quiet for all 4 of those minutes. A sauce put the objection in the formal record, which meant nothing, and the Kethera fleet continued its approach to Earth, which meant everything. Yiren watched the human woman sit back down and pick up her travel mug. Her face was the face of someone who had already run the numbers and knew exactly how this played out, and had stood up and spoken anyway. Not because it would work, but because the record needed to show she had tried. He had seen that face before. It was a dignified face. Tragic, but dignified. He filed her under admirable, feudal, moved on. The Kethera hegemony was not a cruel empire by galactic standards. They did not destroy worlds. They absorbed them, brought them into the hegemony's economic and administrative structure, extracted what was useful, suppressed what was inconvenient, and moved on to the next one. They had done it 40 times. Their military was the largest standing fleet in the known galaxy. 10,000 ships organized with the kind of precision that came from 4 centuries of doing exactly this. Their general, Vreketh Sur, had personally overseen the absorption of 7 worlds. He was methodical, he was experienced. He was, by every metric the Council used to evaluate such things, exactly the right officer for a 72-hour pacification of a Tier 0 planet with no fleet and no galactic alliances. The Council's long-range sensors tracked the Kethera fleet as it moved through Sector 7. 10,000 ships, clean formation, textbook approach. Yiren had seen this particular shape of fleet movement so many times that he could predict the next 40 hours without looking up from his agenda. Ground forces would deploy. Communications infrastructure would be struck first, then power grids, then the human governments, and there were apparently many of them, which the survey teams had flagged as a unique administrative complication, would fracture under the pressure of the first 24 hours. Isolated from each other, without power, without communications, they would do what every Tier 0 civilization did when faced with a Kethera fleet. They would surrender. It was not a defeat. It was physics. You did not fight gravity. You fell, and then you found a way to live in the new landscape. The fleet crossed into the Sol system. The Council's sensors tracked it in real time on the main display. A slow, beautiful arc of 10,000 moving lights converging on a blue-green planet that had absolutely no idea what it was about to become. Yiren was about to close his afternoon session and go to dinner when the sensor report updated. He looked at it, looked away, looked back. Earth's orbital defense grid had gone offline. The grid was not impressive by any standard. The survey teams had documented it. A loose arrangement of repurposed satellites, weather monitoring equipment, and a handful of launch platforms that humanity had bolted weapons onto with what the survey teams had described as creative desperation. It was the kind of grid that a Kethera fleet would have dismantled in the first 20 minutes without breaking formation. It had not waited to be dismantled. It was simply off, dark, every node, simultaneously. Yiren stared at the sensor data for a long moment. The tactical logic of it sat wrong with him in a way he couldn't immediately name. A last-stand defense made sense. Futile but emotionally coherent. A preemptive surrender broadcast made sense. But switching off your own defenses before a shot was fired, without a word, with no communication of any kind, he marked it under surrender posturing. Probable, and closed the file. Across the chamber, Dr. Anand had not moved from her seat. She was holding her travel mug in both hands. She was looking at the main display. Her expression was the most neutral thing in the room. Not blank exactly, but smoothed down to something that gave nothing away. She looked, Yiren thought, like someone waiting for a bus they knew was already on its way. The Kethera fleet crossed the threshold into Earth's orbital space in perfect formation. 10,000 ships, the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. The observation feed showed them catching the light of the human sun, small and yellow and unremarkable. And the fleet in that light looked like something out of the history paintings his civilization made of great moments. From the gallery, it was almost beautiful, the way any ending is, once it has decided to be inevitable. Yiren went to dinner. He ordered something warm and sat by the viewport and watched the stars, and did not think about Earth at all, because there was nothing left to think. The math was settled. The outcome was known. In 72 hours, a new world would join the hegemony, and the council would update its records. And in a year, no one would remember that the planet had ever been anything other than what it was about to become. He had a second cup of tea. He slept without dreaming. In the chamber below, Doctor. Kipriya Anand sat alone at her observer station until the late cycle. She did not leave. She did not make calls. She refilled her travel mug from a small thermos she kept in her bag. She watched the display. She waited. The first strike hit Earth's communication towers at the third hour of the standard cycle. The Council's observation feed showed it live. Clean, precise, exactly where the Kithara strike maps said it would be. 17 relay towers across the northern continent, taken out in a single coordinated pass by a wing of hegemony fast movers. No wasted energy, no collateral spread. Reketh Sur ran his operations the way a surgeon used a scalpel. Minimum cut, maximum effect. The chamber filled up over the next 20 minutes. Word had spread through Nexus Station the way word always spread. Through aides. Through corridor conversations, through the particular tone of someone walking fast who did not normally walk fast. By the time the Kithara's second strike wave crossed into Earth's upper atmosphere, there were 60 bodies in the chamber, where there were normally 26. Nobody sat down. Iran stood at the gallery rail with his hands behind his back. He had seen this before. The second wave always hit power infrastructure, grids, substations, the large relay points that cities needed to function. Without light, without heat, without communications, populations became isolated from their governments and from each other. Fear moved faster than any military vehicle. Isolated people made bad decisions. Bad decisions became a cascade. The cascade became compliance. He had watched it happen on 7 different worlds. The second wave hit exactly where he expected. Power grids across 4 continents. The feed showed cities going dark in real time. Great patches of light dying on the night side of the planet, swallowed one by one like candles in a draft. The chamber murmured. Junior delegates pointed at the display. An analyst from the Velhari administrative team began narrating the strike pattern into a recorder, explaining each phase for the formal record. Ren listened with half his attention and waited for the surrender broadcast. It did not come. The Kithara completed their second wave, formed up for the third. The third wave was always the military installation strike, the last functional resistance, removed cleanly before ground forces landed. Standard, practiced. Inevitable as the next step in a sequence he had memorized 400 years ago. The fleet moved toward Earth's military coordinates. The coordinates were empty. Iron straightened slightly, not enough for anyone to notice, just enough that he felt it in his spine. The Kithara sensors were excellent, the best in the known galaxy. They swept every military installation they had mapped from the survey data. Airfields, naval yards, the large underground structures that the survey teams had cataloged as probable weapon storage. Every location came back the same way. Abandoned, cleared out, cold, not destroyed, not bombed by the humans themselves, which sometimes happened when a civilization chose denial over surrender. Simply empty. Whatever had been in those places was not there anymore. The humans had moved everything, or hidden everything, or done something else entirely that the Kithara sensors could not name because they had never needed a name for it before. The third wave had nothing to hit. Reketh Sur rerouted it. Logical decision? Send the third wave down as ground support for the landing instead. The general was adaptable. That was what made him good at his work. The ground transports broke atmosphere 20 minutes later. 80,000 Kithara soldiers in armored carriers descending in columns towards 6 landing zones across the planet's major landmasses. The carriers were built for exactly this. Wide, heavy, able to land in unprepared terrain. Each one carried a garrison unit and a pacification team and the standard equipment for establishing a hegemony administrative zone. They landed without resistance. The chamber was very quiet now. Even the analyst had stopped narrating. Iran watched the feed from Landing Zone 1, a flat plain outside a large human city on the northern continent. The carriers settled into their formation. The ramps came down. 80,000 soldiers stepped onto the soil of a planet that had not fired a single shot at them. The pacification broadcast went out on all frequencies. Standard hegemony format, pre-recorded in 42 of Earth's documented languages. Clear, simple, offering the standard terms: administrative transfer, civilian protections, a 6-month transition period before full hegemony governance. They waited for the reply. The plane was empty. The city behind the landing zone was quiet. Nothing moved on the roads. Nothing moved in the fields. No officials. No military representatives. In no crowds. Nothing. The silence lasted 4 minutes. Then from somewhere inside the city, not from the walls, not from the rooftops, but from somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere deep, came a sound that the feed's audio sensors took 3 seconds to classify. An explosion. Large. Not from above, not from orbit, from the ground. Followed by a second one, then a third in a different part of the city. Then something that wasn't an explosion at all, but registered on the Kethara sensors as a large mass moving very fast in a direction that large masses did not typically move. One of the council's analysts pulled the feed to a secondary screen and magnified it. He stared at what he was seeing. He pulled it up again, thinking the resolution was wrong. It was not wrong. A Kethara armored column that had moved 2 kilometers into the city's outer edge had stopped. Not because it was under fire from in front. It had stopped because a bridge, a full vehicle bridge, reinforced Durasteel construction, pre-cut at both anchor points, had been dropped on it from the side. Not bombed, not demolished. Dropped. Tipped sideways off its foundations by something underneath it, landing across the column like a hand swatting an insect. The analyst made a sound with no translation equivalent. Several things happened at once. The Kethara column's sensors lit up. The city, which had been silent, was not silent anymore. But the sounds were not the sounds of a military engagement. They were the sounds of a city that had become an obstacle course by design, every street blocked. In every route collapsed or flooded or closed in some way that had no military logic to it whatsoever, unless you understood that the logic was not military. The logic was, you may have entered the city, but you will not move through it. Rin's hands came down from behind his back and rested on the gallery rail. At Landing Zone 3 on a different continent, a Kethara supply convoy had taken a road out of the landing perimeter and found the road ended in a crater that had not been there 6 hours ago. The convoy reversed, found the road behind it blocked by 3 of their own disabled carriers, which had been disabled by something the sensor logs described as improvised projectiles of unclear manufacture from an unknown number of sources in an unknown number of positions. The convoy was not destroyed. It was stuck. At Landing Zone 5, Reketh Sur's command unit received a sensor report that 4 of their communication relay posts, freshly set up in the last hour, had gone offline. Not attacked. Offline. Physically disconnected at the base. Someone had walked up to them and taken them apart. Reketh Sur had been general for 30 years. He had absorbed 7 worlds. He had a particular expression he used in situations that did not match his existing models. A flattening of his jaw, a stillness around the eyes that his staff recognized as the moment before he began asking very pointed questions. He was wearing that expression now. His first transmission back to Hegemony High Command was not a victory update. It was 3 words in Kethara military code that translated approximately, Iraz requesting clarification on engagement parameters, which was the Kethara military's formal language for, something is wrong, and I do not yet know what it is. The chamber reacted, not loudly. The council was not a body that reacted loudly to anything, but the quality of the air changed. The murmur shifted register. The analysts stopped pointing at things and started writing things down instead, which was different, which meant they were no longer describing what they saw and had started trying to understand it. The Melvari delegate who had made the sound translating as finally the day before was standing with his arms folded, looking at the feed, saying nothing. Aaron did not look away from the display. When he was running the same sequence he always ran when a battle showed early irregularities. Checking for variables he had missed, conditions the survey data hadn't captured, equipment failures, communication errors. Something that explained the gap between the outcome he had predicted and what the feed was showing him. The bridge was still on the feed. A Kethara rescue team was trying to move it. The bridge, designed to carry the weight of large vehicles, was not moving quickly. They let the fleet through. The thought arrived in his mind clean and separate from everything around it. He had marked it as surrender posturing the night before, switching off the defense grid without a fight. But there had been no surrender, and the military installations had been empty. And now there were no officials, no broadcast, no compliance, and the humans were not fighting the Cathara at the city walls. They were inside the city, waiting. They had let 80,000 Cathara soldiers walk into 6 cities on 6 continents without resistance. And now those soldiers were in those cities, and the cities had become something different from what they had been 12 hours ago. Iron's jaw tightened. A small thing, barely visible. He pulled up the Galactic database on his personal screen. Found Earth's entry. Opened the military history file. The file was long. He skimmed. He kept skimming. He scrolled past documented conflicts and found more documented conflicts and kept scrolling past those and found more still. Wars on flat ground. Wars in thick forest. Wars in frozen mountain ranges at heights where the air barely existed. Wars fought underground. Wars fought across water. Wars fought in deserts so hot that the equipment failed before the soldiers did. He scrolled for a long time. The database had a standard field for number of recorded armed conflicts. Most species, their developmental age sat between 50 and 100. The field for Earth returned a number that made the standard field too small to display it. He had to expand the column. He sat with that number for a moment. At landing zone 1, the Cathara column that had been pinned by the bridge was receiving fire now. Not from military positions, from windows, from rooftops, from places inside the city that should have been civilian infrastructure. Small arms and not Cathara grade, not anything close to Cathara grade, but coordinated in a way that made the column unable to advance and unwilling to retreat without covering fire they did not currently have. The soldiers on the ground were trained and armed and outnumbered the city's defenders by an enormous margin. They could not find the defenders to outnumber them. Dr. Annan had not left her observer's station. She had refilled her travel mug somewhere in the last hour. She was sitting with both hands around it, watching the feed with an expression that had not changed since the hegemony's announcement the previous day. Neutral, settled. The expression of someone watching a sequence of events they had not caused and could not stop, but had perhaps, in some way, nobody in the room was yet prepared to say out loud. Expected. Erin looked at her. She did not look back. On the main display, 6 Cathara landing zones sat on 6 continents of a planet that had offered no military resistance, made no surrender broadcasts, sent no officials, and was currently in the process of making 80,000 of the best soldiers in the known galaxy very, very lost. The chamber was quiet. Erin looked back at the display, looked at the bridge sitting on the Cathara column, looked at the empty sensor returns from the abandoned military installations, looked at the scroll of Earth's conflict history still open on his personal screen. He closed the survey team's original assessment, the one that ended with pre-industrial conflict patterns, low galactic threat index. He did not yet know what to replace it with. But he knew, in the particular way that 400 years of watching wars had built into him, the same way a coastline builds a sense of where the water wants to go, that the number in that database field was not a sign of a broken civilization. It was a number that described a civilization that had been practicing something for 10,000 years. He just did not yet know what. The bunker outside what used to be Seville smelled like wet stone and old coffee, and the particular kind of tired that does not go away with sleep. Admiral Sofia Vasquez had not slept in 31 hours. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, not by checking, just by the weight of it sitting behind her eyes. She was eating something from a tin that she had decided, at some point in the last hour, not to examine too closely. It was warm. It had protein in it. That was enough. Around her, the bunker worked. That was the only word for it. A dozen people at a dozen stations, screens lit, voices low, passing information back and forth with the efficiency of people who were frightened and professional at exactly the same time, and had learned that the second thing was the only useful response to the first. Maps on the main wall. Casualty reports coming in from 6 continents on a rolling screen that nobody looked at for too long. Communication channels open to 37 different command units scattered across the planet, each one in a different city, each one doing the same thing Vasquez was doing in this bunker. Holding, not winning, not yet, not close to yet, holding. She set down the tin and picked up a marker and walked to the map. It was a physical map. Paper, mounted on board, the kind that still worked when the power failed and the screens went dark. She had learned that from a general who had learned it, from a general who had learned it from a war that had happened before most of the galaxy knew humans existed. Zone 4 is being pushed back, said her adjutant, a young man named Torres, who had the particular talent of delivering bad news in a voice that did not make it worse. How far? 8 blocks. She found Zone 4 on the map, thought for a moment, drew a line 6 blocks back from where they currently were. Tell them to fall back to here. Controlled. Leave the outer 2 blocks looking empty. Torres relayed it without asking why. He had stopped asking why on day 2. The why was always the same. Make every meter of ground cost the Kethera something. When not soldiers if possible, time, ammunition, fuel, confusion. The Kethera had 80,000 soldiers on the ground and a fleet in orbit that could level every city if Reketh Sur chose to use it. Vasquez could not match that. She was not trying to match that. She was trying to make the math stop working for them. Every hour a Kethera column spent stuck in a block street was an hour it wasn't somewhere else. Every supply convoy that arrived 3 hours late instead of on time was a cascade of small failures that added up to something larger. Every garrison soldier standing in an empty building, waiting for an attack that came from a different direction, was a soldier not advancing. The Kethera had numbers and technology and total air superiority and a fleet that nothing on Earth's surface could touch. Vasquez had time and terrain, and in 10,000 years of humans making each other's lives very difficult in very creative ways. She went back to the tin. On Nexus Station, Day 3 looked different from a gallery seat. The Kethera held Earth's orbital space without contest. The feed showed their fleet in clean formation above the planet. Undisturbed, unchallenged, exactly where Reketh Sur needed them. His air cover was total. His supply lines from orbit to the landing zones were functioning. On any display that measured the large shapes of a conflict, the Kethera were winning. The casualty reports told a different story, and they told it quietly in numbers, the way bad news always preferred to arrive. The Council's analysts received the Kethera casualty data through back channels. 3 member species had economic treaties with the hegemony that required joint operational transparency, which meant the lost numbers flowed into Council databases, whether the hegemony intended them to or not. On day 1, the numbers were small, expected. Ground operations always produced friction. On day 2, they climbed, not dramatically, steadily. The way a tide comes in, each individual wave looking small, the accumulated change looking large when you compared it to where the waterline had been that morning. On day 3, the analysts stopped narrating the feed. Aaron noticed this. He noticed it the way you notice when background noise stops. Not by hearing it go, but by suddenly becoming aware of a silence that hadn't been there before. Henny looked at the casualty data himself, pulled it to his personal screen, read through it twice. The Kethera were losing soldiers at a rate that did not fit the model. Not catastrophically. This was not a rout, not a defeat in any shape that the word usually took. The fleet was intact. The air superiority was intact. The landing zones were secure. But the ground forces inside the cities were bleeding, slowly, consistently, a constant, grinding loss that accumulated hour by hour in every zone simultaneously, as if the planet itself was a surface that wore things down by simple contact. He opened the engagement reports that accompanied the numbers. They made difficult reading, not because they were dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic. They were a long list of small, specific incidents. A supply vehicle disabled by a device buried in a road, a garrison post losing power because something had been removed from the building's infrastructure during the night, a Kethera unit taking fire from a position that, when cleared, turned out to have been abandoned before the clearing team arrived. Another unit finding a route blocked, another finding their communications dead for 6 hours with no clear cause. Nothing that looked like an army. Everything that looked like a city that had decided collectively to be as difficult as possible. Iran set down the report. He opened Earth's military history file again. He had looked at it on day one and stopped when the number of recorded conflicts made the standard database field too small. He had not gone further than that. Now he went further. He read for a long time. The Orvani-Suleth trade dispute he was supposed to be managing sat unread on a secondary screen. He did not open it. What he was reading was not a history in the way the Council's database usually recorded history, a clean timeline of conflicts, treaties, resolutions. Earth's file was something else. It was dense, layered. Each conflict referenced three others that had preceded it and shaped the tactics used in it. Wars that lasted a decade. Wars that lasted a generation. Wars that had no clear resolution, just a grinding halt that both sides agreed to call an ending. Wars in every terrain imaginable. The survey teams had noted the variety almost as a curiosity. Humans had fought in jungles where the heat and wet destroyed equipment in weeks. They had fought in deserts where the cold at night killed soldiers who had survived the heat during the day. They had fought on frozen plains in winter so severe that the ground became a weapon by itself. They had fought in mountain ranges at heights where the air was so thin that moving from one position to another required rest that lasted longer than the movement. They had fought underground. They had fought in swamps. They had fought in cities, which the survey teams had noted with particular interest, because fighting in cities was considered by most galactic military doctrine to be the most expensive, slow, and painful form of conflict in existence. The humans had done it hundreds of times, not because they were good at it, because they had kept doing it until they became good at it. Every loss teaching something, on every failure producing someone who survived it and applied what they had learned to the next one. 10,000 years of humans fighting other humans on every terrain the planet offered, each generation inheriting the accumulated knowledge of every generation that had bled before it. No one had ever taught them. No treaty had protected them during their development. No galactic council had stepped in to prevent their conflicts, to manage their growth, to ensure their wars were short and limited and didn't produce the kind of deep, ugly expertise that came from fighting without rules for a very long time. They had just been left alone, and they had spent that time becoming very, very good at something that the rest of the galaxy had decided was no longer necessary. Iran looked up from his screen, looked at the feed. Amma looked at the casualty numbers still climbing in the corner of his display. He thought about the 40 worlds the Cathara had absorbed before Earth. He thought about what those worlds had in common. They had all been Tier 1 or Tier 2 civilizations, young, space-capable, or nearly space-capable, registered with the Council, operating under the galactic framework of protections and limitations that the Council applied to developing worlds. Those protections meant no major external conflicts, no wars of conquest against them until they reached full membership. A sheltered development period that also meant, and he had never thought about this part before, had never needed to, that none of them had ever been allowed to become dangerous. The Council had protected 40 species from the kind of conflict that produced Vasquez, that produced bunkers outside Seville, and maps on boards in 31 hours without sleep, and a tin of something unidentified, eaten without complaint, because there was work to do. The Council had kept them safe and soft and completely, utterly unprepared for the day the Cathara decided they were useful to absorb. Iran said it out loud, quietly, to no one in particular, to the empty air beside him. We thought we were keeping them safe. The words sat in the air and did nothing. No one in the chamber was close enough to hear them. The analysts were at their stations. The delegates were in clusters. The feed ran its numbers in the corner of every screen. He became aware, slowly, that someone was looking at him. Dr. Elanan was at her observer station 20 meters away. She was sitting very still, both hands around her travel mug, and she was looking directly at him. Not pointedly, not with anger, just looking. The way someone looks at a thing they have been waiting for the other person to notice, and have been waiting patiently and are not surprised that the waiting is finally over. He did not know how long she'd been watching him put it together. He looked away first. On the main display, a Cathara armored division was moving through the outer edge of a city on the southern continent. The feed tracked it, a long column of the best-equipped ground vehicles in the known galaxy, moving slowly through streets that had been emptied of civilians and filled instead, with the kind of careful attention that people who had been doing this to each other for 10,000 years knew exactly how to deploy. The division reached the inner boundary of the city. The city let it in. The numbers in the corner of Iron's screen ticked upward, small and steady, like a debt collecting interest. He sat with it, all of it, the file, the number too large for the standard field. The wars in the jungles and the deserts and the frozen mountains, the 40 protected worlds, the 40 worlds that had lasted 72 hours, the bridge on the armored column, the empty military installations that had been emptied before a single shot was fired, because someone had looked at a Cathara fleet and understood immediately that the buildings were not what mattered. The Cathara had spent 4 centuries conquering species who had never been allowed to learn how to make conquest expensive. They had picked Earth last. They had picked Earth because it was small and unregistered, and had no allies and no fleet and nothing that looked like a threat from the outside. They had been correct about all of those things. They had been wrong about the only thing that mattered. On day 9, Torres brought Vasquez a report at 0400 hours. She was already awake. She was always already awake at 0400. Sleep had become a thing she did in installments. 90 minutes here, 2 hours there, snatched between briefings like something stolen. She took the report from him, read it once without sitting down, folded it in half and set it on the edge of the map table. "Start phase 4, she said. Torres nodded. He had learned not to ask her to repeat things. She picked up the coffee pot from the small burner in the corner of the bunker, poured what was left of it into her cup. It was cold and thick and had been sitting since midnight, but she drank it anyway, looking at the map, thinking about supply lines. The Cathara held every city. She knew this. She had never planned for them not to. Holding a city and controlling a city were 2 different things, and the difference between them was the thing she had been building for 9 days. Not a defense, not a front line, not any shape of resistance that looked like resistance from above. From orbit, from the clean perspective of a fleet that could see everything and touch very little. What was happening on Earth's surface probably still looked like the slow, grinding end of a population that had nowhere to go. That was the point. Every city the Cathara held needed soldiers to hold it. Soldiers needed food, water, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Those supplies came from the landing zones, and the landing zones were connected to the cities by roads, and the roads ran through a planet that had spent 9 days becoming a problem. Not a wall, not a barricade, a problem. The kind of problem that didn't announce itself, that materialized in the gap between when a convoy left and when it arrived, in the form of a vehicle that had developed an unexplained fault, or a road that now had something wrong with it that wasn't there yesterday, or a communication relay that had gone quiet for reasons that took 3 hours to investigate and 2 more hours to fix. By which point the convoy was 6 hours behind schedule, and the garrison it was supplying had started rationing. Individually, each incident was small, resolvable. The Cathara were not stupid. Their logistics teams were experienced. Their repair crews were fast. Their communication systems were redundant. But there were not enough of them. There were 80,000 soldiers on the ground across 6 continents, spread across 6 cities, each city a labyrinth that had been made more labyrinthine with every passing day. Each of those soldiers needed to be supplied. Each supply run was an opportunity for something small and expensive to go wrong. And the humans, operating in terrain they had lived in for generations, were moving through underground passages and maintenance corridors and the unmapped spaces between buildings that no survey team had ever cataloged, made sure something small and expensive went wrong as often as possible. It was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It looked from close up like ordinary people doing ordinary things. Moving packages, cutting wires, redirecting water, placing objects in specific locations at specific times. Most of them were not soldiers. Most of them had never been soldiers. They were people who had been told in the clearest possible terms, exactly what was needed from them, and exactly how to do it, by a command structure that had been preparing this particular shape of resistance since the day the hegemony's announcement had arrived. Vasquez had not built this in 9 days. She had built it in 2 years. From the moment the council's survey teams had accidentally made contact and everyone with clearance to know about it had understood what contact with a galactic community containing the Cathara hegemony eventually meant. The supply numbers were the things she watched. Not casualties, not territory. Supply numbers. A garrison that couldn't eat became a garrison that couldn't function. A garrison that couldn't function became a problem for Rekith Sur, and a problem for Rekith Sur became a request to Hegemony High Command, and a request to High Command became a resource allocation decision, and resource allocation decisions had a way of pulling threads that, once pulled, kept going. She finished the cold coffee, got back to the map. Nexus Station, when an analyst named Ferrith of the Valari had been staring at the same data set for 6 hours. He was a small being, Ferrith, built close to the ground, with the wide eyes his species used to process the light levels of their homeworld's deep forests. He was very good at his job. He had been the council's primary economic analyst for 22 years, and in 22 years he had never asked to speak to a senior ambassador directly. He asked now. Irin received him in his office at the 7th hour. Farath set his data tablet on the desk without preamble and pointed at a column of numbers that meant very little to anyone who wasn't an economic analyst, and everything to someone who was. The Cathara supply chain, Farath said. I've been running the consumption rates against the hegemony's known logistics capacity. Irin looked at the numbers. And? They need to double their supply runs within the next 4 days. Farath's finger moved down the column. To double supply runs, they need more cargo ships running the surface routes. To free up cargo ships, they pull them from perimeter patrol rotations. He looked up. The perimeter gaps that creates are detectable by ground-based systems. Irin was quiet for a moment. The humans don't have anything that reaches orbit. They didn't on day 1. Ferrith pulled up a second data set. 3 of our sensor buoys in the outer Sol system registered impact events in the last 48 hours. Small, consistent with low-yield projectiles launched from the surface. He paused. The Cathara have lost 4 logistics ships in high orbit in the last 2 days. They've classified the cause as mechanical failure. Ren looked at the data, looked at Ferrith. They're launching from the ground, he said, with what the survey teams classified as pre-FTL launch technology. Repurposed. Ferrith's wide eyes did not blink. They built something with it, something that can reach the gaps in the patrol rotation if you know when the gaps are. And if you've been watching the patrol patterns for 9 days. Irin sat back in his chair. How long before the Hegemony Senate receives the supply cost projections? They may already have them. Ferrith picked up his tablet, hesitated. Ambassador, yes, the 3 economic treaties that give us access to Cathara operational data, they also give us access to Hegemony Senate session records. There was an emergency session 2 hours ago. He set the tablet back down, turned it to face Irin. They authorized a credit instrument to fund extended pacification operations. Irin read the session summary. Read it again. A credit instrument was a financial tool. You issued one when a project cost more than your current budget allowed. You priced it based on a projected end date, how long the project would take, what the total cost would be, what the return would look like once it was complete. Investors bought the instrument because the end date gave them a timeline for their return. A credit instrument required an end. The Cathara's Senate had authorized one. The Senate's financial modeling division had attempted to set a price. The price required a projected end date for the Earth pacification. The model had returned an error. Not because the math was wrong, because the input was wrong. Every variable the model used to calculate an end date, rate of territorial control, rate of resistance reduction, rate of compliance increase, was moving in the wrong direction or not moving at all. The model could not find a point on the horizon where the conflict resolved, because the conflict did not look like a conflict with a resolution. It looked like a planet that had decided to be expensive indefinitely. The Senate had overridden the error and issued the instrument anyway. Set an arbitrary end date based on historical pacification timelines. When the instrument had been purchased by 3 major hegemony-aligned economic houses, and 2 investment groups from council member species, and a sovereign wealth fund from the Melvari Compact. All of them had bought a financial product priced on an assumption that Aaron now understood to be incorrect. He thought about who he needed to call, decided he needed to think longer before calling anyone. "Thank you, Fareth," he said. Fareth left. Aaron sat with the tablet. The credit instrument would fail to pay its projected return. When it failed, the 3 economic houses would seek compensation from the hegemony. The hegemony, already extending its operational budget, would have difficulty providing it. The 2 council species investment groups would bring the shortfall to their governments as a diplomatic matter. The Melvari Compact, who had a seat on the council and a vote, and 3 additional treaty relationships with the hegemony that all touch this same thread, would begin making very quiet calls to their treasury departments. A war that could not be won within its budget did not stay a military problem. It became an economic one, and economic problems had a way of becoming political ones, and political problems in a structure as interconnected as the hegemonies had a way of finding the weakest point in the architecture and pressing on it until something gave. The humans had not done this by accident. The thought arrived with the same clean certainty as the one 9 days ago. They let the fleet through, and it sat in the same place in his chest, solid and cold. They had not let the fleet through because they had no choice. And they had let the fleet through because they had understood from the moment the hegemony's announcement arrived, maybe before that, maybe from the first day the survey team had made contact and the shape of the galaxy had become visible, that fighting a Cathera fleet in orbit was a war they could not win. So they had not fought that war. They had chosen the only terrain where they had an advantage, their own planet, their own cities. 10,000 years of knowing exactly how to make a piece of ground as expensive as possible to hold. And they had waited for the fleet to come down, for the soldiers to walk in, for the supply lines to extend, for the cost to accumulate day by day in numbers that a Senate financial model could not find an end for. They had never been trying to win. They had been trying to make winning cost more than the Kethera Empire could afford to pay. Reketh Sur's final transmission to Hegemony High Command arrived in the Council's intercept log at the 9th hour. Aaron read it, 3 sentences in Kethera military code. He sat with it for a long time. He did not share it with the chamber. Some things needed to settle before they were said out loud. In the bunker outside Seville, Torres brought Vasquez a second message at noon. It came from Earth Joint Command Intelligence, and it was marked with the classification code she had been waiting 9 days to see. She read it once, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, looked at the map, drew a line through the last phase. "Tell all zone commanders," she said, "to hold current positions and wait for my signal. We're not pushing yet, and we're just letting them feel it." Torres relayed it, came back, looked at the map, looked at her. "How long?" he asked. She picked up the marker, looked at the numbers on the rolling screen she had avoided looking at for too long. Casualty numbers, supply numbers, the grinding daily arithmetic of a planet that had decided to be a problem. "Not long," she said. She did not say it like a victory. She said it the way a person says something true. Without decoration, without relief, just the bare fact of it sitting in the air between them. She got back to the map. The Kethera withdrawal did not look like a withdrawal. That was the first thing Aaron noticed. He had seen withdrawals. He had seen armies that knew they were beaten, the particular shape of a fleet that had accepted a reality it did not want and was moving to limit further loss. There was a recognizable quality to it, a deliberateness. Even defeat had its own kind of structure. The Cathara fleet did not move with that quality. It moved instead the way a business closes, quietly without ceremony, attended only by the people who had to be there. The ground transports lifted from 6 continents over the course of a long afternoon. Not all at once, not in any formation that suggested a planned extraction. They left when they could, loaded what they could carry, left the rest, vehicles, equipment, temporary structures, one of the material residue of 22 days of occupation, sitting on the soil of 6 cities like furniture left by a tenant who had run out of time. The fleet absorbed them, reformed, held position in Earth's orbit for 4 hours. Then it turned and moved toward the system's edge. No transmission, No ceasefire negotiation, no documents signed, no meeting requested. The hegemony's official communication to the council, issued 6 hours after the last transport lifted, described the decision as a tactical redeployment in light of evolving strategic priorities. It was 4 sentences long and contained no words that meant what they were technically saying, and everyone who read it knew it, and no one said so. The Cathara had run out of soldiers willing to keep dying in cities they could not hold, for an empire whose Senate was receiving daily reports about a credit instrument that was not going to pay what it had promised, at a cost that was adding a number to their operational debt every single hour that did not have a projected end because nobody could find one. They had not surrendered. They had simply stopped. Earth's sky cleared over the course of a morning. The orbital sensor network, rebuilt in pieces over 22 days from components that should not have been able to do what they were doing, confirmed it first. Then the visual observations came in from high-altitude positions. Then the communications, cautious at first, then overlapping, then a sound that was not a word in any language but existed in all of them, moving across the planet in a wave that followed the sunrise. Where in the bunker outside what used to be Seville, Torres showed Vasquez the confirmation report on his screen without saying anything. She looked at it, looked at the sky through the bunker's narrow window, gray and ordinary and empty of everything that had been in it for 22 days. She sat down. It was the first time Torres had seen her sit down voluntarily in a week. She sat there for a little while. Not long. Long enough. Then she stood up, put on her jacket, and said, "Start the infrastructure assessment. I want damage reports from all 6 zones by tonight. We have a lot of work to do." Torres nodded. He was already writing it down. She picked up the thermos from the corner of the desk, the one she had been refilling for 22 days. Battered and scratched and wearing a dent on its side that had not been there before. And she walked out of the bunker into the gray morning air, and she stood there for a moment, breathing it. Then she went back inside. There was work to do. The council's emergency session was the fastest convened in its 400-year history. Aaron received the summons at the 2nd hour and was in the chamber by the 3rd. Most of the delegates were already there, which told him everything about the level of alarm the withdrawal had produced. The Cathara hegemony had not failed to absorb a target in 4 centuries. The list of things this meant for galactic power structures, for existing treaties, for every species that had been operating under the assumption that the hegemony's military was effectively unstoppable, was a list that nobody in the chamber wanted to be the first to read out loud. The agenda had one item: Earth. The debate lasted 3 hours. Aaron listened to most of it with his hands flat on the desk in front of him, watching the room sort itself into the positions it always sorted itself into. The cautious ones, the reactive ones, the ones who were already calculating what this meant for their own relationship with the hegemony, the ones who understood that the calculation had changed and were trying to figure out in which direction. At the end of the 3rd hour, Aaron asked to speak. He was not someone who asked to speak often. When he did, the room gave him the silence that 400 years and 200 observed conflicts tended to produce. He said 3 things. First, Earth had demonstrated in 22 days a military and strategic capacity that the Council's existing classification system did not have a category for. Whatever category they invented needed to be invented carefully and soon, because the galaxy had just watched it happen and would be drawing its own conclusions. Second, a species that had just demonstrated that capacity was not a species you wanted to leave unaddressed. Not out of fear, though fear was reasonable, but because unaddressed problems had a way of becoming larger problems. And this particular problem came with 10,000 years of practice at making things expensive. Third, the correct response was immediate, formal, way and generous contact, not because humanity had earned goodwill, though it had, because the alternative was leaving 11 billion people who had just done what they had just done with no reason to consider the Council anything other than irrelevant. He sat down. The vote was not unanimous. It was close enough. Dr. Priya Anand walked into the council chamber at the 5th hour, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing for 2 days and carrying the scratched thermos that had apparently made the journey from Earth to Nexus Station in her bag. She looked like someone who had not slept in 3 weeks because she had not slept in 3 weeks. She looked like someone who had recently eaten something from a tin without examining it too closely. She had the particular quality of a person who had been waiting for a very specific thing to happen and had now watched it happen and was currently feeling none of the feelings she had expected to feel because there was no time for them yet, and also because some things were too large to feel all at once. She sat down at the observer's station, set the thermos on the desk, waited. The council's head administrator, Sauce, read the formal welcome. It was the longest formal welcome on record. 4 different drafts had been combined in the last 2 hours, each delegate wanting their own concerns and conditions reflected in the language. And the result was a document that took 11 minutes to read aloud and contained, at its core, in underneath the diplomatic architecture and the careful phrasing and the 17 clauses that all said variations of the same thing. One simple meaning. Please be on our side. Annan listened to all 11 minutes, drank from the thermos twice, did not change expression. When Sauce finished, there was the formal pause, the space in which the receiving party was expected to respond. Traditionally a prepared statement, traditionally several minutes, covering gratitude and commitment and the shape of the future relationship. Anayan set the thermos down. She looked at Sauce, then she looked very briefly at Erin, then she looked back at Sauce. She spoke for less than 30 seconds. The chamber did not react immediately. Immediate reactions required the thing that had just happened to be a size that fit inside the normal dimensions of a reaction. What she had said did not fit those dimensions. It filled the room differently, not like a sound, but like a change in pressure, something that arrived in the body before the mind had processed it. 26 species went very still. Sauce looked at his desk. Erin's hands, which had been resting loosely in front of him, were flat and pressed against the surface. He was not aware of having moved them. The Melvari delegate had turned to the colleague beside him and then turned back, mouth open, and had not yet closed it. What she had said, nobody repeated. It was not the kind of thing that benefited from repetition. It was the kind of thing that sat in a room and did its work by simply existing. Curie, the way a very large and very quiet animal does its work by being present in a space. The session formally adjourned 12 minutes later. Nobody talked much in the corridor outside. Erin went back to his office. It was a familiar office. He had occupied it for 11 years, and before that there had been other offices on other stations. But they had all accumulated the same quality. The stacked records, the cold light, the viewport looking out on docked ships in open dark. He sat at his desk, opened the Galactic database, found Earth's entry, Tier 0, pre-FTL, low galactic threat index, pre-industrial conflict patterns, no registered fleet, no treaty relationships, observer status only. He read it for a moment, read it the way you read something that used to be true and has recently, definitively, stopped being true. He deleted it. The field sat empty, a blank where a classification used to be. He stayed with the blank for a while, longer than he expected to. 400 years had given him the ability to sit with uncomfortable things without needing to immediately make them comfortable, and he used that now, letting the blankness be blank, letting the not knowing stay not known until the right shape of it arrived. He thought about Vasquez, whom he had never met and whose face he had only seen on a feed from a planet he had never visited, eating something from a tin at 4 a.m. in a bunker that smelled like wet stone, drawing lines on a paper map because paper still worked when everything else failed. He thought about the file, the number too large for the standard field. He thought about what Anand had said in the chamber, which he was not going to write down anywhere, which he was going to carry for a long time without knowing exactly what to do with it. He opened the classification tier field, started typing. He tried the Thal concept for deep patience, the word his people used for geological time, for the kind of waiting that mountains did. It did not fit. Too passive, too still. He tried the Velhari concept for accumulated danger, the way their language described a thing that had been building pressure for a very long time. Closer, still not right. It implied an explosion. What Earth had done was not an explosion. It was a sustained, grinding, managed application of everything a species became when it was left alone with itself for 10,000 years. He pulled up the Cathara's own intercept logs. When he read through the words their generals had used in the final days, the ones that had no clean Cathara equivalent, the ones they had borrowed from Earth's own languages because no other language had a word for the specific texture of what was happening to them. One word appeared in the logs more than any other. First in Rekethsur's reports, then in the Senate financial documents, then in the hegemony's own internal assessments, passed around quietly among people who were trying to understand something that their existing vocabulary could not hold. Ren typed it into the classification field. Quagmire. He looked at it. Let it sit there. It was a human word, an old one, from a language that had existed for several hundred years before the survey teams had even known where to look for Earth. It meant ground that looked solid and was not. Ground that accepted your weight and then took it. Ground that gave way slowly and completely, and from which the only escape was to never have entered it. He saved the file, closed the database, sat for a moment longer in the familiar office with its stacked records and cold light, and the viewport looking out on the dark. Outside on a station that had existed for 4 centuries and had never needed to reconsider anything as fundamental as what it had just reconsidered, things were quiet. Delegates in corridors, aides at desks, the ordinary machinery of a governing body absorbing a new reality in the careful, slow way that governing bodies did. He stood up, put on his coat, turned off the light. He went home. Went through corridors he had walked 11,000 times without thinking about them. Into an apartment he had occupied for 11 years, with its familiar furniture and its familiar view and its familiar quiet. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then for the first time in 11 years, for the first time, if he was honest with himself, in longer than that, he checked that the door was locked. It was. He stood there anyway for a moment, his hand on the frame, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went to bed. Behind him on the screen he had left open on his desk, Earth turned in the live feed from the Sol System buoys, blue and scarred and very, very old. The Terminator line moved across it in real time. Shadow chasing light, chasing shadow. The way it had moved for 4 billion years before the first Cathara ship had crossed into its system, and the way it would move long after the credit instrument defaulted and the Senate hearings concluded and the galactic community finished deciding what it thought about what it had just seen. 11 billion people who had spent 10,000 years learning to survive each other were for the first time in a very long while pointing that knowledge somewhere else. The galaxy was paying attention. It had learned to.